Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Absolution or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Faith, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Absolution Chapter 1 Ultimatum. Rolling hills as far as the eye could see glowed under May's flower moon, and the sky full of speckled stars really drove home for Nicta how peaceful her life here was. The acreage she shared with Tally and Sarah wasn't so remote that it took more than an hour to get to Fort Salem, and they weren't exactly off the grid, despite what some people believed. As if to remind her, they weren't living in the sticks. A distant set of headlights beamed down a rural back road at the far reaches of the property line, and Nicta tracked it idly until it disappeared again. In the hour she'd been outside, half a dozen cars had come and gone. Ranchland was in high demand around these parts, and they had secured themselves a sizable parcel. Nobody came particularly close to bothering them. Here, Nicta had privacy, somewhere she could shrink into the darkness or step into daylight without a target painted on her head. She cloaked the sense of safety their home provided around her at all times, giving her freedom from the chaos, should she inch a toe outside its boundaries. Their distance from prying neighbors and main highways alike allowed her the peace of mind necessary to get a good night's sleep, and she wouldn't trade that for anything. Something Sarah had chosen to brush off despite her front row seat to the last year and a half of Nicta's life. How easy it was for her to forget. Bastard. Nicta closed her eyes and remembered to breathe again, letting the tension from their fight roll through the parts of her connecting to the earth and drain away with considerable effort. She didn't want to be angry all the time. It just happened to be her default setting these days. If she were in a better mood, she would probably admit she was as much to blame for escalating the argument as Sarah. The suffocating happiness that awaited a little ways down the hill kept her locked up and with her back turned on the house. Its windows alight with a warm, welcoming glow, and the porch stacked with various types of solar globes that Sarah insisted on collecting. The house and expensive yard were a cozy and inviting sight when she wanted them to be, just not when she felt so wholly unwelcomed within those walls. She chose to sulk out here, to prove a point, and refused to entertain the idea she was making things worse. It suited her vibe a hell of a lot more out here than a fancy dinner inside with her partners, where Tally's jingly pop tunes would drive her fucking crazy, and she and Sarah would pretend nothing was wrong for Tally's sake as they so often did. Whatever. This was what Sarah expected of her anyway. Nicta belonged in the dark more than either of those two would want it to admit. She grew up here, harnessed it, drank it in, and used it to survive. Out here, under the stars, she could think clearly, something the other two took for granted, and Nicta never would again. The flick of her favorite lighter broke the quiet, and the sizzling flame rose to Nicta's face, where it lit a cigar she had perched between her lips. A stolen artifact from Sarah's office that she was pretty sure came from some sort of foreign ambassador years ago. Nicta had swiped it earlier that evening when grabbing some files from Sarah's office, and intended to tease her about it over dinner. Sarah's whole "my ancient body is a temple" thing got on Nicta's nerves most days, but then she supposed if she was 1,000 years old too, she might take better care of herself. Sarah did sometimes accuse her of being too reckless, and Nicta had worked to rein that in without becoming a boring stick of cardboard, unlike most of the military types that came around to visit Tal and Sarah from time to time. Nicta made herself scars in those instances. She might be old in her bones, but the rest of her was full of rage and whiskey, and not even her retired fuddy-duddy of a girlfriend was going to take that away from her. She was nearing 56 and did not look a day over 30 by design. Her firework could go on forever if she wanted it to, but she had changed her methods to let it creep up on her as it would Tally and the pitiless Sarah. Eventually they would appear around the same age or approximate, saving themselves some heartbreak down the line. Nicta never wanted to live forever, and Sarah seemed satisfied with her mortal life now too. This was, of course, assuming Nicta didn't transform herself into a stranger and disappear over the distant hills one of these days. Tonight, she was considering the consequences of such an act, and flicked her lighter on again. The flame burned in the darkness, and Nicta held it up in front of her, contemplating its power and all it could do if she let it. Changing her face would be so simple. Nicta's fist shook and the flame reflected in her glassy eyes, calling to her from somewhere in the distant past. The cigar burned in that moment, and Nicta sucked in a breath, immediately hacking away as the acrid taste burned her lungs and she ripped it from her mouth. If choking to death was to be her fate, of course it would happen when she was all alone at night on a hill mere steps away from their home. No more than an hour after her yelling match with Sarah. What a way to go that would be. And not at all more ammunition for Sarah to gloat with at her funeral. The thought brought another scowl out into the open, and Nicta shifted her position with an uncomfortable grunt. Something as stupid and mundane as moving closer to the city and Fort Salem shouldn't have blown up in her face the way it did. Sarah brought it up so flippantly, and as though the decision was already signed and sealed, because goddess forbid Tally couldn't cut down on her daily commute once she ranked up to major. When Nicta was immediately and emphatically what the fuck about it, she would have thought the only other option on the table was to slay Tally where she stood, given the outrage Sarah had expressed. Nicta laughed it off as insanity, because the woman was certifiable if she believed for 1 second Nicta would agree to the move, and the rest of their evening had imploded from there. Replaying the build-up annoyed Nicta all over again, and she nearly crushed the cigar between her fingers. Where had Sarah been for the last 14 months? Did Alzheimer's set in at some point and Tally forgot to tell Nicta that their lives prior were a figment of Sarah's imagination? Nicta would rather set herself on fire and let it burn forever than go anywhere near the city ever again. Sarah's flippancy on the matter pissed her off to no end. Holding up the cigar and scowling, Nicta took another pull and started sputtering. She made a face and tossed it in the dirt, snuffing out the burning end with the heel of her boot. "Civilians are disgusting," she grumbled, wiping her hands on her pants and fiddling with the lighter again instead. The cigar had been an act of retribution and boredom, whereas the lighter itself was an old friend. She never left home without one, not even these days when it was fairly useless. "Better not let anyone else hear you say that," came a voice approaching from the bottom of the hill, and Nicta glanced over her shoulder to watch Tally ascend towards her. Nicta's sudden dismay had nothing to do with Tally, and everything with the assumption that Sarah hadn't given enough of a fuck to come out here herself. Not that Nicta had really expected her to. That would require a level head and the type of self-reflection capabilities that had fallen out of Alder maybe 200 years prior. Nicta loved Sarah as she was, arrogant and assuming among other things, but that didn't stop her from wanting to throttle her in her sleep sometimes. She knew the feeling was very mutual. Tally reached her and promptly flopped onto the grass, groaning as though the short hike had been hard for her. Like Tally didn't have gazelle legs and lean muscles for days, and Nicta ought to know. She'd had those legs thrown over her shoulder late into the morning. That was a thought that finally broke a smile out of her hibernation, which she promptly squashed and faced forward again. She was supposed to be miserable and alone, and Tally was the one person who could easily torpedo that, likely why she had appeared instead of Sarah. Tally stretched her legs to one side and propped her weight into the other arm, leaning into Nicta like she didn't have a care in the world. None of this was accompanied by words. Nicta wasn't fooled, though she wouldn't turn down Tally's company, as annoying as it was to feel nerves when she wanted to stew in her own self-righteous anger instead. The internal restlessness that plagued most of her waking hours seemed to calm whenever the redhead was close by. Tally was like the broken MILF whisperer, and she was too damn sweet for Nicta to be mad about it, even now. She hated needing anyone, but if she had to pick someone to feel at peace with in a room, it would be Tally. Nicta supposed that should make her feel somewhat guilty about Sarah being the opposite these days. Only right now she couldn't care less. At least, that's what she told herself when she remembered the look of disappointment and disgust in Sarah's eyes right before Nicta stormed out the back door. Nicta had booted over the ugly fucking garden gnome that sat on the edge of their deck and let it sail into the line of bushes marking the back of the barbecue area. For some goddess-unknown reason, Sarah loved that thing, and the dick move had restored some of Nicta's swagger as she trudged up here. And Tally, poor Tally, had just been standing there the whole time they screamed in the kitchen, watching the two of them inch closer and take up more space than either of their small frames should allow. All of this, as though the three of them hadn't woken up to glorious morning in bed, drinking coffee and listening to Tally rattle off reports from intelligence that were probably supposed to be classified if you weren't sleeping with Sarah Alder, who got to know anything she asked for. Nicta was just a byproduct of being a lazy fuck and had listened while her head stayed nestled in Sarah's naked lap, dozing while Sarah played with her hair and idly read the newspaper. Simple, yet perfect. Nicta was almost as mad as Sarah for ruining what started as a good day as she was for the argument itself. Tally looped an arm around Nicta's to break through her thoughts. Her chin perched on Nicta's shoulder, and she fixed her with that infamous pout. It was the same face that melted Sarah's stone-cold heart whenever she was in a mood, or doused Nicta's flames when she was in a rage. Tally Craven and those goddess-forsaken dimples had Sarah Alder and Nicta Batan cradled in their depths and held them hostage from the moment she took them into her life and her bed. Nicta didn't want to be soft right now, however, and while she relented in letting Tally try to side-cuddle her, she stayed facing forward. "I'm not going back," she said evenly. Tally sighed and curled in closer. "Please," she murmured, pressing a soft kiss to Nicta's shoulder. "I don't like it when you're out here all alone." "Afraid I'm going to slip away again and never come back?" Nicta asked dryly. She might have an explosive temper and therefore tended to walk away when an argument overloaded her brain, but they both knew she didn't have the heart to walk away for good. Not like a coward in the dark without saying anything. Not from you two. Sometimes Nicta thought it would be easier. It would still never happen. "No," Tally countered. "More like there are coyotes out here and you're very tiny looking, all scrunched up in the dark. Wouldn't want them to get the wrong idea." Nicta scowled and immediately bumped Tally with her shoulder, which only made her cling harder. They were quiet for a bit after that, and Tally, in her Tally way, just let Nicta come down on her own. She eventually wormed her way into a half-hug to keep warm, nestling her cheek onto Nicta's shoulder and letting her fingers play with the skin at the small of her back, tracing little lines back and forth underneath her shirt. Nicta's body shivered beneath her touch and finally relaxed. The quiet and peace returned. Nicta buried her nose into Red's hair and breathed her in. She would happily stay out here all night. That is, until Tally shivered for the third time in as many minutes, and Nicta realized it wasn't an act. She really was getting cold. Nicta ran hot most days, unsurprising considering her adeptness with fire, she supposed, and hadn't noticed the dip in temperature. She disentangled from Tally and removed her hoodie, making a show of fluffing it up and draping it around her girlfriend's shoulders. "Chivalry isn't dead," Tally quipped, grinning when Nicta waggled her eyebrows and cast her a flirtatious wink. The noticeable uppick in mood perked Tally right up, and she tried not to give it away by looking too hopeful. "I would really like us both to go inside now, maybe since cooler heads can prevail?" Nicta probably looked as psyched as she felt, but Tally produced that Oscar-nominated pout yet again and begrudgingly got the older witch to her feet. The knower was good at eventually worming what she wanted out of people, though somehow it never managed to be anything nefarious, which was impressive. Tally held the kind of power that no one had seen in almost 2 centuries. Yet, she seemed content to only use it for good. Old Nicta would have been annoyed. New Nicta was also annoyed, but similarly impressed and supportive. In their domestic life, it was Tally's eyes that were her most deadly weapons, followed closely by her smile. Nicta hadn't been able to deny either of them long before Craven one day climbed into her lap and pressed their lips together. She certainly wasn't going to grow a pair and start resisting now. They ambled downhill hand in hand, and Nicta's gait noticeably slowed when they approached the house. Tally tightened their fingers to give an extra pull. Come on, Nick. Please just give her a chance to apologize. Nicta snorted, digging her heels in and coming to a complete stop. Telly sighed and turned to face her at the foot of the porch, dropping hands. What's wrong? You really believe the woman in there is going to apologize to me? Nicta cast a sneer to the back door. She was arrogant. And? Telly quirked an eyebrow. That's nothing new. You know that as well as I do. Tell her as much. I think she knows, Nicta grumbled, kicking a toe in the dirt and shoving her hands into her pockets, now that they were free. Some of her irritation shredded away to be replaced with the nagging guilt now permanently lodged in her chest. Tally, I haven't changed my mind. I'm really sorry. I don't want to move closer to the city, or in the city, I seem to remember her suggesting. And we're not doing it unless everyone is on board, which you've clearly demonstrated you're not, so what's the problem? Now it was Tally's turn to sound irritated, which made Nicta balk and take a subtle step back. Tally caught her mistake and skipped down the back steps to return to her, snagging Nicta by the front of her t-shirt. She yanked her forward and bit back a smile when Nicta's limp body swayed uselessly in place, looking very much like a sulky kindergartner. Baby, you have as much a say in this as we do. Tally reminded her more gently this time. Maybe Sarah's frustrations didn't come out super eloquently, but you know she didn't mean to imply you were stubborn, idiotic, nonsensical, Nicta direct quoted, challenging Tally's optimism with a cocked eyebrow. Like I'm a selfish, herbited fuck that's putting a dent in my girlfriend's career because she has to drive an hour to work every morning and stay on base when it's late at night? Yeah, the thought had already occurred to me many moons before Sarah decided to repeat as much to my face. Tally flinched, while her grip on Nicta's t-shirt remained unyielding. None of that is true, she whispered softly, only for Nicta to look away again. Yeah, Nicta already felt pretty crappy before tonight. There was no sense in denying it to herself. Tally's part in this and her willingness to bend just for Nicta brought deeper shame and guilt to Nicta's half of the argument, but it wasn't enough to change her mind. Nobody knew where the infamous Nicta Batan, pardoned terrorist and public enemy number 1, lived. Being in the middle of nowhere helped keep it that way, without neighbors to speak of and private land on all 4 sides. Of course, it would be easier for Tally if they lived closer to Fort Salem, where she was mere months away from obtaining major status, and she assumed bump in responsibilities. There would be more nights spent on base and less in their bed, which disappointed Nick to no end, but it was Tally's dream to work her way to the top. She chose it. Therefore, Nicta supported it, and felt like an asshole long before Sarah pointed out she was being one. I don't want to hold you back, Tell. Nicta grimaced at how weak her own voice sounded. It knocked a few more inches off of her height until she could practically cut the grass with her teeth. Hey, Tally was frowning now, as she gave a rough yank on Nicta's t-shirt and forced her to take a step forward, pressing their bodies together and holding her there. Don't say that, Nick. I get it, believe me. I don't want to put you through last year all over again. Goddess, you're more important to me than a shorter drive. And you're more important to me than my own happiness. But here I am anyway, Nicta thought to herself. For a brief instant she thought Tally read her mind when her brow knitted together and she looked concerned. But Nicta brushed it off and glanced away again rather than ask. I just don't love things sprung on me, you know? It's not like I want to stay out here by myself while you and Sarah move to the... Tally's lips smashed against hers and abruptly cut off the thought. Shut up, Tally murmured, keeping a firm grip on Nicta's and sliding the other hand up to the nape of her neck. She smiled into the kiss when she felt Nicta melt. It was her weak spot. I'm not going anywhere without you, and neither is Sarah, okay? She murmured when the kiss broke apart. Don't be ridiculous. Only Tally could somehow manage to make Nicta feel better, and like an even bigger pile of shit at the same time. She wasn't complaining about Tally's mouth on hers, though, and it was the deciding factor in her choosing not to sleep out here under a tree. If she froze to death overnight, it would serve Sarah right, and then Nicta would come back and haunt her ass, literally. Tally's happiness came first, however, and she wasn't about to deny her twice in one evening. Fine, Nicta's face would freely give away state secrets for a chance at an out, but I'm not apologizing unless she does first. Taking what she could get. Tally wrapped her hand around Nicta's again and pulled her up the back steps before she could change her mind. Nicta's legs carried lead in them, and she followed at a begrudging pace. It took less than 10 minutes of fragile coexistence before they were at each other's throats again, making Tally want to scream. Tally barely knew what happened. One moment they were mixing drinks with awkward small talk, and the next Sarah made an offhand comment about possible listing prices for the property or something equally as stupid. Tally wanted to smack her. It devolved so quickly from there, she couldn't keep track of the arguments being tossed around like eggs in the air. The fallout smashing all around them while Tally didn't know where to go or what to mop up first. "Then leave!" Nicta shouted before long, waving a hand wildly at the door. "If you don't fucking get me anymore, Sarah, if you forgot what last year of my life was like." "Our life," Sarah cut her short, and Nicta sneered while pushing on. "Then I guess I'll just fucking stay here while you take Tally and live a happy life in the city without me. I'm sure it'll be a lot more peaceful without the pain-in-the-ass loser bogging down your social life." "Nicta, no, really, it must really suck that you can't take your murderer house pet to any public places without causing a scene these days, huh?" Nicta threw back. "Please tell me how difficult that's been for you." "Nick," Tally tried next, but Nicta didn't even hear her. When she got angry about something that truly mattered to her, Nicta was a bull in a china shop, and a deaf one at that. Sarah's anger flared, and, in a momentary fit, she tossed her whiskey glass into the sink, shattering it to pieces. Tally nearly jumped through the roof, and Nicta ballooned. "Enough of this nonsense," Sarah barked, stuffing down the brief stab of remorse when she saw the look in both of their eyes. Instead, she puffed up and loomed taller over Nicta, whose fingers bit into the counter while fire raged in her dark eyes. "Perhaps if you didn't behave like a scolded schoolchild sentenced to a life in detention and gave a shit about your own happiness." Nicta's eyes flashed, and she just about rounded the counter to get in Sarah's face. The only thing that kept her back was Tally, who suddenly jumped in between them. Not for the first time, but certainly the last. She was finished with these two and their drama. "Stop it!" Tally yelled, and Nicta halted without taking the burning gaze away from Sarah. "You both need to figure your shit out, because I cannot play the person in the middle anymore." Tally's referee face suddenly broke wide open, and it was enough to make both Nicta and Sarah grind to a halt. Silence so thick, Tally could taste it permeated the room. She vibrated when she put herself in between them, and neither woman dared step out of line. "You need to figure this out. Both of you," Tally repeated, more slowly and calmly after the world's longest pause. "And you're going to do it with someone else to mediate, because I really can't take this roller coaster anymore, from either of you," she added, shooting Sarah an extra glare for good measure, so she didn't just think it was Nicta who was being a pain in the ass tonight. Nicta might be the most offensive woman she had ever met, but Sarah egged her on with her arrogance in arguments like this. They were both goddess-awful at communicating during times of turmoil, and that needed to change. Sarah retracted from the counter and reached for Tally, her expression significantly softer than when she was glaring at Nicta. "Darling." "No." Tally held up a hand and pointed at her. "No, you don't get to play 'we're not mad at you, just at each other' card anymore. I love you, Sarah, and I love you, Nick, but I can't do this back and forth thing with you two anymore, where you're laughing one morning, fucking that afternoon, and then tearing each other to pieces all evening." "We are not that bad," Sarah argued, only for Tally to push her mouth shut in a fit of annoyance. Sarah bit her tongue. "It's not healthy and it's not okay anymore." Tally's glare moved between them. "It never was. I just thought eventually you would figure it out on your own. But I can see that's not happening, so here we are." There were actual tears in Tally's eyes this time, and she hurriedly swiped at them when she realized they were falling, lest they distract from her point and the fact that she was furious. Nicta moved like she wanted to touch her too, but took a hint from the way Tally had stopped Sarah, which was encouraging. At least they listened to her on occasion. Tally never thought her relationship with each woman could be so good. Meanwhile, the two of them were either cracking jokes and kissing or going to war over things great and small at any given moment. She knew they loved each other, and had for over 20 years, but this thing they kept doing had to stop. "I mean it." Tally straightened her posture, and while she hardly towered over Sarah, at this moment in time she was the tallest one in the room. Tomorrow, I'm putting in a special request to have us visit the psychology department off campus. No arguments, she added, before either of them could cut in with a refusal. Nicta stared at Tally like she had just suggested they bring Captain Verger into their little polycule. You want the three of us to go to therapy? She asked skeptically, almost ready to laugh at what she was sure had to be a misunderstanding. Yes. Tally glared so hard Nicta lost a few more inches of height. Is that a problem, Batan? Now it was Nicta and Sarah who exchanged a disbelieving stare, thus putting them on the same page for the first time all evening. It would have been endearing if Tally hadn't wanted to knock both of their blocks off. You either hate each other or you love each other, she murmured, dropping her eyes to the counter when she couldn't bear to see the answer for herself. I don't know if either of you even know which wins out anymore. Tally, I don't hate Nicta, Sarah said immediately, reaching out and touching her arm. Tally's, that was. She realized her mistake a split second after the fact and only then snapped her gaze apologetically to the object of her statement. It was too late, though. Nicta's whole body stiffened as she pushed away from the counter, pacing away from them and out of reach. Sarah's eyes flashed with remorse. Nick! No, it's fine. Maybe Tally's right. Nicta combed her fingers through her hair and kept her back to them. Her voice was evenly controlled, though Tally could sense the beating drum of emotions ricocheting around her chest. Tally shot Sarah a harsh glare and pulled her arm away. The General could be so fucking insensitive some days. It was unbelievable. Nicta was first to speak after a long silence. I mean, you have a 335-year-old retired and formerly dead general, a pardoned terrorist who most civilians still want on a pyre, and the most powerful knower in this military since the 1830s. But hey, should be easy to figure out what's wrong with us, right? When she turned back to the others, every inch of her face was carefully controlled, and the hint of defiance laced back into her smirk. Whether she fooled either of them or not, they didn't say. In her mind, there was not a person alive or dead that could figure out what the fuck was going on with them. She and Sarah, on their own, were a handful as it was. Maybe Tally did deserve better. Scratch that. Nicta knew Tally did. She just wasn't sure which of them was brave enough to pull away first, or if they were both cowards. Or maybe it was Nicta herself that was the problem, and she was refusing to take the hint. You don't respect each other, Tally stated like it was the most obvious thing in the world. At least not when you get pissed off about something. The way you talk to each other, the way you fuck each other when you're mad, it's not healthy. And I don't want to be the thing that stands in the way just because you're both trying to keep me happy. That makes me not happy. Both parties worried themselves closer to her, and Tally promptly threw her hands up and took a step away. No, I mean it. Either you two agree to therapy, together, and put some damn effort into figuring out your past and whether we can move on, or I'm gone, from both of your lives, she clarified, and that really smashed a hammer over the atmosphere in the room. Nicta was numb from head to toe at the idea, and Sarah, as stone-still as she stood, radiated devastation. You're saying you're going to leave us? Sarah's voice was decibels quieter. Tally bit her lip just to keep her face from crumpling. I love you both, she said firmly, looking from one to the other. I want our lives to be together. But enough is enough. I won't spend the next 50 years watching you tear each other down. So figure it out, because I don't know how much fight I have left in me. The room was deadly silent as Tally cast one last sorrowful look to the both of them, then turned and headed for the main stairs. Sarah leaned into the counter and bowed her head, long tendrils of hair falling around her face. Nicta was statue-like for a minute, wondering whether a rock had taken place of her heart, and if it lived there for good now. When it became clear they didn't have much left to say to each other, Nicta started out of the kitchen. She stopped only when Sarah's voice called her back. I love you. Nicta paused over the threshold, closing her eyes and fighting against a choking tightness suddenly constricting her throat. She felt the words everywhere and nowhere, rolling across her skin and trying to find some place to sink inside when she was so conditioned to keep everything out. For months now, and years before that. How many times had she wished to hear that exact thing from this exact woman over the decades? Now she heard it every day, and Nicta still didn't feel it where it mattered. Sarah shifted behind her, and Nicta sensed her growing apprehension. Despite everything that had happened tonight, she managed to force her voice out, gravelly but at least not weepy or weird. "I love you too," she echoed back, and suddenly her heart was back where the rock had been. She did love Sarah Alder. She just wasn't sure that was enough to save them this time. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.